I'm curious how you respond to Candace Chen in Ling Ma's novel Severance here, how you understand the kind of fits and starts that she goes through as she lives with this disintegrating world that's present in the novel. You know, these moments, whereas one moment as she meets Jonathan, she says, "My heart barked confusedly with love." So these kind of like these shifts emotionally that are forced by the disintegrating world around her, and her sense of place within it. Within this novel, it's kind of interesting how you think about the novel's tone here, that how Candace speaks from and within a post-apocalyptic world, and yet, you know, there's a certain comedic impulse that runs throughout the novel. How do you read that sense of comedy versus tragedy here as her world disintegrates, as she comes face to face with the prospects of raising a child in an emptied world? And I would point to three significant aspects of the character here as you read. How the character emerges from experiences of trauma and isolation, how Shen fever itself works as an impact on the character, both the social and physical experiences of it, and also how pregnancy is an aspect of the character's world. First, all trauma here. Candace lives with a strong sense of detachment. She's in this world that's been emptied. She's in this city that's been emptied. As she says on page 257, "I have always lived in the myth of New York rather than its reality." And she comes face to face with the realities of an emptied city as the novel progresses. And one of the things that defines the character is how she comes to this awareness and how she responds to it. However, how she responds is at a certain level of detachment, right? As she sees the awfulness of what goes on around her, as she reflects, as she's in sitting with her at her mother's deathbed, she wants to, engage her mother and have a kind of a final conversation that redefines their relationship. But she realizes on 186, the last days are for relief, not for truth. So she doesn't provoke her mother into a final conversation. Instead, she sits with her while she's dying. And Candace has that sense of detachment as she moves through a dying city as well. Trauma impacts Candace in various ways. That she has the loss of those who are significant to her. Her mother and father die. And her father dies in an accident suddenly. And so that leaves its trace on her. Also, Jonathan leaves her within the city. Evan betrays her to Bob, and Evan himself commits suicide partly out of that act. So those losses go into defining her as a character. She also feels a growing sense of isolation in a disintegrating New York. That she sees those she works with, those she moves through the city with, disappearing. She feels the city emptying, and that leaves a traumatic influence on her as well. Also, as she connects with the group and is traveling towards Chicago, she feels a very kind of traumatized response when in how Bob rules over the group. And that culminates in his decision to, imprison her within the mall, and how she responds to that. This, also kind of indicates a sense of trauma. She sees the violence that the group does to the fevered, and that certainly has an impact on her sense of being in a traumatized world. There's one moment in particular on page 222 I wanted to point to. There's this moment where she suddenly discovers that Jonathan has left his retainer. He's left, but she finds his retainer within her apartment, and she says, as she responds, "I stood over the sink and he eased the thing into my mouth. It was too big. His teeth were not my teeth. I looked at myself, my freakish, grotesque self, a mouth full of metal and plastic jutting out, and knew I was alone. I spit the retainer out. I washed it, filled the mug with fresh mouthwash, and placed it back in the medicine cabinet. I thought absurdly that I'd keep his retainer fresh for when he returned. That's where it still is, in my old apartment. So she responds to Jonathan's departure, in a way that makes sense. She tries to hold on to him, but realizes he's gone, but yet she still hangs on to the retainer, right? That as she thinks about the prospects of him being gone, maybe all the way to Puget Sound, she says, or maybe dead along the way or fevered, that she feels some need to hang on to the possibility of his return. A second factor that influences the character in this novel is Shen fever and its influence upon the memory itself. So versus a disease that prompts forgetting, Shen fever is a disease of remembering. Ling Mao writes, the fevered are trapped indefinitely in their memories. My memories replay unprompted on repeat. So this sense of like a memory that is physical and palpable through the disease is something that influences not only the fevered, but also seems to influence Candace herself. It comes out in the book structure, that the book itself is a series of flashbacks, of extended flashbacks, where she recalls her losses, trying to reconstruct moments of connection with her family and with Jonathan. She also, indicates her memory by her need to document New York's decay through the New York Ghost website, right? She takes the pictures of the city, these small moments, these glimpses, moments of light and shadow, moments of individual points of contact, sometimes without even words being passed. She documents those things on the internet, that kind of great, collective memory, as she says earlier in the book, where they will be there in memory, in perpetuity, even after her death, perhaps. And we also see a sense of memory and how it affects those still living in Bob's need to return to the Illinois Mall. As he says on 246, this place holds a great deal of sentimental value for me. It also holds a sense of his memory as well, right? That it connects him to who he is, and Candace engages with that as she speaks to him, up into that final night where she escapes. You see that sense of memory, and the uncertainty of it is still there, though. Of how it defines the person as she's recollecting her flight from New York itself. She drags the cab driver Eddie from his cab. He appears to be feverish as she does. And as she tells us on 278, she says, that is the true story of how I left New York. And yet it's possible that there's another true story. In this version, maybe he wasn't fevered. Maybe he had been trying to get out of the city like I was. Maybe despite his frail, weakened state, he had stopped to help me, a familiar person he knew by the side of the road. And maybe I had misidentified him as fevered. It's possible. I can't be sure, because I wasn't really all that careful. All I thought about was myself. It got me where I needed to go. So there's a sense in which memory is there, and memory has kind of been put into hyperdrive by the Shen fever, and but that Candace is trying to, even while she's trying to recover memory, right? She's still uncertain about the impulses that it maintains against survival. And then pregnancy is also an influence here, right? That Candace inhabits a woman's body throughout the novel, and at whatever levels of detachment she moves, she connects to her body and her sense of need to survive for the child's sake here. Pregnancy impacts how she's seen by Bob and the group. That she is seen as the group's hope, and kind of almost like as almost the the progenitor of a messianic figure, in a way. And it also connects her to her mother, who returns in dreams to tell her that you should escape now. On page 244, the mother, her mother returns to care for her, in the situation of the pregnancy. Bob tries to put her in isolation when they get to the mall. You know, as he says right on 167, it makes us feel hopeful. I can't have you leaving. But that throws, you know, Candace into, you know, a great sense of need to escape from that point. You know, when she's speaking, as she recalls speaking with Jonathan, and at the moment she was going to tell him that she's pregnant, and yet he's still going to leave. She says, I decided right then and there this protective feeling toward an indeterminate bundle of cells inside of me. In that moment, I knew. So her pregnancy drives her, you know, to care for the unborn child. Her mother's directions, you know, come to her in the midst of pregnancy. You have to get the key, she says, then you get out. So this kind of drive for survival that's mediated through her mother's dream presence is part of her response to the pregnancy. And it also propels her back into connection with others as she in her flight from the mall, she moves toward the city, not away from it. And she travels into Chicago as she flees from Bob's group. And as she says on 290 near the end, to live in a city is to live the life that it was built for, to kind of reconnect with human presence. And that's where Candace goes as character. It'll be interesting to see how you read her in the novel. Thanks.